Okay, so today our task is to recrystallize the tryptamine and the tranexamic acid. And I have the 2 vials of tranexamic acid. This is the my 83 milligrams or so from the extraction, and then this is the tranexamic acid from the column. They both look about the same on the GC mass spec, so I'm going to combine the 2 of them and recrystallize them together. And we'll do that in a 25 milliliter Erlenmeyer flask. So the first thing to do is to mass one of these and then dump the solid in and see how much we're working with. So we'll just tare the entire Erlenmeyer flask. And then we'll dump the entire contents of both these vials in there and weigh it again to get the massive solid that we start with, which should be roughly the sum of the 2 masses that you've already obtained. But sometimes it doesn't all come out. I'm just going to leave a little bit of residue. So the combined mass of those 2 is 0.189 grams, 189 milligrams of tranexamic. Well, closer. Now it's 190. Let's say 190 milligrams, 0.190 grams of the slightly impure tranexamic acid. And we know that the impurity is vanillin, as we saw in the GC mass spec. So what we're going to want is a boiling stone in there so that it doesn't bump when we start heating it. So put one nice big boiling stone in there. It'll be easy to pluck that out later. And then we're going to heat the 4-to-1 mixture of the water and ethanol. So I'm going to make up about 10 milliliters of that solution, and I'll heat that in a separate Erlenmeyer flask, so I also need a boiling stone or 2 in there. I've just got a bunch of these out in case I need them. So I got two separate stirring hot plates out here, so we can work with the tranexamic acid on one and the tryptamine on the other. So we're going to add 8 milliliters of water and 2 milliliters of ethanol to make our 4-to-1 aqueous ethanol solution. This is DI water from the Gen Chem lab, although we could probably just use tap water. In organic chemistry, we're not worried about contamination from metal ions. And then we'll just fill that the rest of the way. I'm not worried about getting a tiny little bit of ethanol into DI water. It won't hurt anyone. And I don't think it'll take more than 10 milliliters. And as usual, I like to sit that in a little Erlenmeyer flask just so it doesn't fall over and get contaminated. So we'll pour that in there. And just stick that on the hot plate. Turn that up to about 100. 125 maybe, just to get it boiling pretty quick. And that can just dry in the back. Now for the tryptamine, I'm going to try just plain old ethanol. So on the other hot plate, I'm going to add a boiling stone or 2. On this hot plate, I'm just going to heat up about 10 milliliters of ethanol in a small Erlenmeyer flask. Kind of hard to pour out of these bottles without spilling. So I'll just crank that up. Ethanol boils at 78, so if I turn this up about midway between 100 and 150 on the dial, that's probably a good setting. I got another one of those out in case I need it. And then we've got our tryptamine in the beaker that we left in the desiccator. And it's a little bit yellow, as we saw. So normally you want to do recrystallizations in a Erlenmeyer flask to limit the amount of evaporation. But in this case, I think since this material is already in this beaker, I'm actually going to add a boiling stone to the beaker, and I will add the hot ethanol directly to the beaker, and then we'll transfer the solution once it's dissolved. So I just add a boiling stone to that. And probably need more than one pipette, so grab another one. Shouldn't need that anymore. So the plan is to get the solvent boiling, and then once the solvent is boiling, we're just going to add the solvent to the powder until it just dissolves. And as soon as we've added a little bit, we're not going to heat these on the hot plate yet because we don't want to char the solid, but as soon as it's dissolved a little bit, then we'll put them side by side so we can add fresh hot solvent. And we do want to give it a little bit of time. We've got a couple of glass rods here to kind of break up the material to try to get things to dissolve. And just so I don't lose track of what's what, I'm going to label this with a TCA so that I know that that's tranexamic acid. So that was a mixture of two different lot numbers from your notebook, because you had the lot number assigned to the crude tranexamic acid off the extraction, and then you had another lot number for the material that came off the column. When we purify it and we filter it again, we'll get a third lot number for the new purified material. And of course you had a lot number for the tryptamine, and then once it's purified we'll get another lot number. So I'm going to break that up a little bit. That solid's kind of in large chunks. And when it's in large chunks like that, it doesn't dissolve readily, and often goads you into adding a little bit too much of the recrystallizing solvent. We only want to add just the minimum amount necessary to get it to dissolve. My guess is tryptamine is soluble enough in ethanol that we'll be working with well less than 10 milliliters. So I'll probably end up doing that in one of the 10 milliliter Erlenmeyer flasks instead of the 25s. On this scale, ethanol may not be the best solvent. We'll find out. It may just be a little bit too soluble. I'm pretty sure the 4:1 aqueous ethanol is going to work well here. But once I have this dissolved, if it seems like a very small volume, I may also transfer that to a little flask. So we're just waiting for those solvents to boil. I guess I didn't need that one. Once it's boiling, of course, I'll have to be a little careful transferring with the pipette because there's so much vapor pressure that it tends to spill right out as you attempt to transfer. Eventually we're going to need some vacuum filtration apparatus, so I may as well get that out now. Just take out the whole filtration assembly. It's got all the filter flasks and the funnels. Plenty of paper. And I know I'm going to need an ice bath, so while we're waiting for them to boil, we'll go get some ice. Ice water bath. Just set that aside and let that start melting. I will need some cold ethanol, right? So if I recrystallize this from ethanol, I'll have to wash, kind of rinse off the, or wash the solid on the filter paper with some cold ethanol. So I'm just going to drop this entire ethanol bottle into the ice machine so that I have a bottle of cold ethanol when I need it. Actually, yeah, maybe I'll get a bottle of ethanol that's less full. I don't need to cool an entire bottle of ethanol for this purpose. If there's one that's partially full, it looks like they're all pretty full. Drop one of these in there. Just let that cool down. When you do it this way, of course, you have to remember that you have that in there so it doesn't end up sinking to the bottom and never being found again. So that solvent's starting to get warm. I'm just going to pull out like maybe half a milliliter. Add that. Maybe another milliliter or so. The goal is just to get enough solvent on here that I can start heating this without worrying about charring the product. So I'll put those side by side. So now I just want to get both of these boiling, and then I'll gradually add hot solvent until I just get it barely dissolved. And that one's starting to bubble a little bit out one of the boiling stones. Get that go a little further. This is actually probably the Erlenmeyer I'm going to want to put it into to cool, so easy to pour out of that one onto the filtration. Watching solvents boil. You can crank that up a little bit. Obviously that'll boil a little lower because it's pure ethanol, and this one is mostly water. In both cases, the likely impurity is vanillin, and vanillin is pretty freely soluble in ethanol. As you know, if you buy artificial vanilla flavor, it's sold as a solution in ethanol, aqueous ethanol. Good idea to swirl that once in a while. Make sure we don't get any local hot spots. Add another milliliter or so. That should be plenty of solvent to avoid charring. And this is boiling, so I can go ahead and Add a pipette full of that. At least add a little bit. And heat that side by side. I suspect it won't take a lot of ethanol. And that may even already be enough. Yeah, so that's already enough to dissolve it. So probably the best thing to recrystallize that in is actually a small test tube. So we'll grab one of these 3-inch test tubes that's nice and clean. Give that a swirl. Need to get that boiling. So I've already got all of that dissolved. I just want it to boil as well now that I've added it. So the potential problem with recrystallizing tryptamine from ethanol on this scale is just that we're using so little ethanol. Okay, so that's now boiling nicely. I'm just going to decant that away from the boiling stone. We may be using so little ethanol that it's just impractical to run it on this scale. Now we just want to let that cool slowly. Stick that over there in the test tube rack. And hopefully crystals will come back. And turn that off. There's a little bit on here, so I'm just going to dip that in there and try to get the rest of that to dissolve. So we'll let that cool and see if we get crystals. Set that aside for now.